Hello and welcome to Ask Lovecraft After Dark. I am your host, Lehman Kessler, and I am joined this week by author, editor, scholar, and fellow Canadian, Silvia Moreno-Garcia. Welcome, Silvia.
Hi, Lehman. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Now, I think you're probably a little bit more Canadian than I am. Did you do a full Timbit and swear the oath to the Queen and everything?
Yes.
Oh, you were much braver than I was. So Silvia and I have been sort of circling the weird world of Lovecraftiana for a couple of years now. I think we've probably first met through Mike Davis and the Lovecraft e-zine. But I remember the first thing that we sort of worked together on was you asked for reviewers for Fractured: Tales of the Canadian Apocalypse.
That's right.
Oh, and I jotted down. I read it in record speed and jotted down a quick sort of review of it. This was a really fun and very strange project. Can you tell me how you got involved with this particular title?
Yeah, actually, the first title that I did with that press was Dead North: Tales of Canadian Zombies, and then this was followed by Fractured: Tales of the Canadian Post-Apocalypse. It's a literary press. It's called Exile. And what happened was that I won an award with them. And that's how I got to know the press. And I told them, they didn't know anything about speculative fiction. They didn't know what it was. But, when they asked me, so what do you do? What do you write? Aside, obviously, from the story that won the award, I was like, well, I write speculative fiction. And they were like, what's that? And so then I told them about how I had self-published and edited I have edited some anthologies that I had published myself. And so then they said, would I edit something for them? And did I have any ideas about them? And I was like, well, boy, do I have ideas. And so that's how that came out. Now, because it was a Canadian literary press, they get most of their funding from the Canadian Council for the Arts. And the Canadian Council for the Arts demands that you have a certain percentage of Canadianness in order to give you any money. So in this case, we had I think it was 90% Canadian authors. So yeah, we had like two people in each volume who were not Canadian, just like infiltrator Americans. Elise Catherine Towler was one of them. She did a story about undead whale zombies, which actually got reprinted in the Dark last issue. So if you want to see that one. And then, yeah, we also had, I think Oren Gray was in Fractured, and his story got reprinted in Ellen Datlow's Best Horror of the Year. And his story was a story about a ghost apocalypse. So we did get a couple of Americans, but it was mostly Canadians, and that's the reason why it was a simple funding issue.
I can appreciate that. I understand. I lived in Canada long enough to understand the power that CanCon holds. Now, like myself, you were a transplant to Canada. How long had you been there before suddenly you're sort of trying to cobble together, what is Canadian horror?
Well, I've been living now in Canada, I think now for 15 years, but back when I did this anthology, that was maybe 5 years ago. So maybe I've been living there for 10 years.
Okay.
Yeah. And, but a question that pops up a lot in Canadian literary debates or in questions about Canadian literature is what is Canadian literature and what defines Canadian literature. So it's a question that you come about quite easily and quite quickly when you're interested at all in the literary arts, and the answer of what is Canadian literature, I think we all ended up agreeing at one point when we were talking about it that it was wide open spaces, about survival and very depressing, which is why I thought it makes sense, right?
Yes. Well, I think I can't remember if it was a McSweeney's article that came out a while back that was Canadian literature. It may have even been the David Nellie Ortberg on the Toast, but it was just like, we are all in the prairies and we are all dying. There is a pie and it represents our family. Just Southern Gothic, but it's Ontario ?
Yeah.
Do you know the writer and comedy musician Carrie Marin, based out of Toronto?
No.
She wrote I think Weave a Circle Round. She has a fantastic song all about CanLit. Which and specifically her disdain at how it tends to reject genre fiction. Margaret Atwood aside, there seems to be a sort of from the various Canadian writers I know, a prejudice against anything that reeks of genre, that reeks of the fantastic, unless it's kind of Canadian magical realism, which I'm not quite sure what that would look like.
Like Margaret Atwood.
There we go. All right, fair enough. So I've shared the Canlit with our folks viewing along at home. And let's see what's going on here. The Canadian Quota on Arts Project. Yep. Oh, yeah, that's how Doug and Bob McKenzie's kick started with Rick Moranis. Yes, the Doug and Bob McKenzies were parodies, but they were required to. They had to do something that was Canadian. Like, oh, you want Canada? I'll show you Canada. Yeah, that was a really fun book. The Fractured. I think my favorite was still the Anne of Green Gable sort of post-apocalyptic story. You know, editing something like that had to have been a very strange job. Like what types of stories were you receiving that were sort of repeating themselves? Because again, there's not a whole lot of Canada. Everything's so much sort of smaller. So I imagine you were seeing a lot of the same sort of themes repeated.
It's weird. There's something that happens sometimes in the quote unquote slush in the submissions pile.
Yeah.
That I don't know if it's like a virus or something like that, people get the same idea at the same time. And it's not something obvious, like there was a call for like mermaid stories and therefore you're getting all the leftover mermaid stories. It's not like that. Sometimes it really happens that two people in two completely different places have the same exact idea at the same time. Things like zombie baseball, for example. Like two people have a zombie baseball again. You're like, how did this one take place? But that has happened with a bunch of anthologies, not just this one. And I think also people think that they're more original than they really are. They don't realize that they're really not that original, and there's like 20 other stories in submission piles. So when I edited Nightmares, I did a special issue called People of Color Destroy Horror, and I was the guest editor for Nightmare magazine, and I could only pick 4 stories, but I read I don't know, 300 stories, something like that.
Oh, wow.
For that one, which was actually a smaller pile than I normally would have read. I've read bigger piles for anthologies. This one was actually relatively small in the fact that it was maybe 250, maybe 300 submissions. So it wasn't that big. But anyway, in that one of the things that happened is that we got a lot of vampire stories. We got a lot of urban vampire stories. So I guess you would call it urban fantasy. Some werewolves, but really a lot of vampires. And the new angle of all those stories was that it was an urban vampire thing, right? So it was set in the city instead of Dracula. Now that's not very novel right now. It might have been novel in 1981. When we were just transitioning from the old-fashioned vampire to kind of like a more like from Dracula-esque into a more modern vampire. When you see that transition with Interview with the Vampire, and like Poppy Z. Bright writes in the 1990s a vampire book and all that kind of thing. So that might have been quote unquote new back in the 1980s, in the early 1980s. It might have even been kind of new in the 1990s, depending on the angle. But now it's completely like not new, especially if the only angle is these vampires are vampires in the city, right? And they live in Chicago or something like that. So we got a lot of stories that were honestly that, and I think it's people, they think this is really creative stuff, and it's not. Everybody has had kind of the same idea, so that's one. So that's one problem in general with the slush, that you get the same idea 20 times. So everybody in Canada suddenly having the same idea, let's say for Fractured, the North has melted and we're all swimming around in canoes, in Vancouver and other parts, and everybody like you get 6 of those and you're like, okay, yeah. But it was a much smaller slush pile because it was just Canadian in that sense. So again, it was a smaller pile to look at. And there was enough differentiation that I think the stories ended up being quite different. So there's not just like nuclear holocaust. There's, like I said, a ghost holocaust, a ghost ghosts are attacking the living. There was that weird Anne of Green Gables story that was very, weird. There was some stuff that was, yeah, about people killing each other and whatever. But I think the thing that I ended up finding with Fractured Wire was that I thought that there were not a lot of guns in the Canadian post-apocalypse. There's like, I don't think there's a single shotgun in that whole anthology. I don't think, and even though sometimes bad things happen and there's some scenarios that are depressing or not, or not that great, I think in general there's kind of like a more positive tone to the post-apocalypse. So you get a story, for example, where there's this transsexual woman and she's, trying to keep her hormone injections and keep going after the apocalypse. And there's other stories like that where I think it felt a lot more, even Anne of Green Gables story, it was depressing because he's waiting for kind of this clone of Anne. It's this weird story, but it's not hopeless in many of the stories. And like I said, there's nobody with a shotgun chasing anybody. It's not The Walking Dead. It's not Game of Thrones. And I thought that was kind of like, I thought that was the Canadian thing about it, that, it was like, it won't be that bad. We'll all get through it together in a way, even though all the stories are not all happy,
One of our viewers, Elizabeth, asking about that slush trap. How do you, if you're submitting to an anthology, how do you avoid falling into those sort of tropes, even if you can't see what the other subs are, right? If you're thinking, oh, I've got this great baseball story, you don't know that 18 other people have also submitted a baseball story. You're someone who's both edited and also been published in anthologies. How have you found ways to kind of avoid that particular trap?
Yeah. I think one thing that people do is that the latest thing they watch, they kind of go like, I'm going to make this into a story. So I watched an episode of The Walking Dead and I'm going to write it. So avoid doing that. Avoid basing yourself on like popular media. Because other people probably saw the same episode that you saw of The Walking Dead and they had the same idea about zombie baseball, for example. But other times it's just like, keeping the pulse of fiction, right? Of what's going on in the market. And I know that you cannot read everything that's out there in a way, but if you, check out some issues of other magazines, best of the year stories, you can probably see like, was last year like the year of the werewolf? Does that mean that, this year is going to be really hard to place a werewolf story? And it's just harder. It's not impossible, but it's like, did we get 5 takes on werewolves within the last, in big important magazines that made a splash? If so, my take on the werewolf, like substantially different or something in order to get any kind of attention. And you can kind of see that more or less because you hear what's making a splash, more or less people are talking about this story, that kind of thing. So you can get a sense of, it's a black hole. You don't know who else was competing with you in all these other slots and whether 99 people out of 100 submitted werewolf stories. But I would say also don't go for the easy pickings. Werewolves, vampires, and zombies are 3 of the very easy pickings. It's kind of like what everybody gravitates towards. So unless you have
We're having a bit of a connection issue just right about now. So hopefully we'll get Silvia back in just a bit. This Fractured was an absolute delight to review. For folks at home, I put the link to it. I did a review for it for the Miskatonic Musings site, and I've done a handful of reviews, but this was kind of right as I was getting into getting into receiving reviews, having more writer friends. I think this was before I'd really started jumping into the whole PH reads a thing, which is my regular book reviews. And Silvia has been featured in a handful of those PH reads a things. But I do want to segue, since you were talking about having submitted and the way you submit into things. I'd like to hear your story on how you chose to submit Flash Forward to Cthulhu Erotica, Carrie Quinn's anthology of Lovecraft and the mythos and the sort of more sensual side of the mythos, which not a lot of folks think about. This was a collection that came out a few years back, and Silvia, you wrote a fascinating story set in Mexico, and I'm curious how you took the writing prompt for it, or how that story came about, because that was a very fun, very different from all the other stories sort of surrounding it, and I'm curious to know how that came about. Oh, it looks like we may have actually fully lost her. So I will, while we're waiting for her to come back, I will let you all know more about Cthulhu Erotica. So Carrie Quinn, who's definitely someone worth following on Twitter, she put this together back in 2010. This is here we go. Oh, she's back. All right, wonderful. So yes, I don't know if you saw my question, but I'm curious to know about how you came about submitting Flash Frame to Cthulhu Erotica.
I knew Carrie a little bit online because she had done some stuff for Innsmouth magazine, which was what I was running back then. So I knew her like that online, and she just put a call for it and put the picture that was going to be the cover. And I really liked the cover, and that's why I ended up wanting to submit, because of that weird cover. And yeah, I asked her if it was okay to do a story that was not very explicit. Probably. She said it was okay, so I did.
Well, it's fascinating because, yeah, it's not immediately explicit, but anyone who has, lurked around online and found like weird old 1950s Italian erotica, like immediately understands like what it is. Or if anyone who's lived in one of those, old towns with an old creepy 1970s style cinema, there was so much texture. And your use of the color yellow was incredibly evocative. Took me to sort of Carcosa, as the color yellow often does. But I found that really fascinating. It was definitely something I can't imagine there were a lot of stories similar to that of the slush pile. And an anthology like that really probably puts the slush into slush pile. You've now. Oh, have we lost her again? Oh dear. We may we continue having this. May be the theme for tonight, but that's okay. We're going to keep things going. Another collection that some folks have already started mentioning in the chat, and when we get Silvia back, I'll have her talk about is She Walks in Shadows. So She Walks in Shadows was the all-female Lovecraft anthology. PH has done a review of this. It features Molly Tanzer, who we had on about a month ago. And it is a fantastic collection. It is an important collection, and it's done it went in some really fascinating places and allowed writers to explore the side of Lovecraft that the world of Lovecraft can often be a boys' club, as we've talked a lot about on this show. And so She Walks in Shadows, I felt. I was very happy to see it come out. It came out of a weird place. If you watch the Molly Tanzer episode, you'll hear her talk about the origin of it and how it came about through a Facebook argument, which is part of a larger argument that's been going on in all sorts of genre fiction, right? About the role of representation, about how we deal with the fact that there are all sorts of writers that do not look like Lovecraft, and yet they're so often you look at anthologies and they're either all male, they're all white, there's no representation, and people get very defensive about it, and they say, well, I can only print what people submit, and if people aren't submitting to me, then, I don't see color. I don't care if you're white, brown, black, or purple or yellow. And it's like, well, okay, look, guys, you're not getting a lot of purple submissions, so calm down. But diversity does matter. Like you need diverse voices. You need to draw from a wide range of experience. And for a long time, whether sort of through kind of explicit prejudice or implicit bias, people have been locked out of a lot of these publications, the capacity to publish, to have their stories published. And I think it's really important that spaces be created if other spaces are not being reformed to do that. Silvia's got a really fantastic Twitter feed that's worth following. And she deals with this a lot. She talks a lot about being a person of color, being a woman of color, and how that impacts being published, getting representation. And I think it's folks really owe it to themselves to educate themselves about the state of the field by following her and other female writers, writers of color, people who are talking about diversity and talking about inclusion in a very active way, not just sort of like, oh, it would be nice if there was diversity. These things this is not a passive value; it's a very active value. So we were talking about She Walks in Shadows. I've been giving it the hard pitch, and because Molly came on the show about a month ago and told us the origins of it and how it kind of came out of debates about the presence of women in Lovecraftian and horror. So you were there and you actually put this whole thing together. So can you tell us more about She Walks in Shadows?
Yeah. Did she tell you about the online discussion that happened that inspired?
Yes. The do women not like squid? Oh no.
It was very strange. It's always very strange. I said that contributors that anthology and me should be into the Nazi gas chambers. There's people who really respond to that. I mean, we have like Shirley Jackson is a weird fiction writer. Mary Shelley, science fiction, and arguably also Frankenstein kind of. You got people like Daphne du Maurier and many other writers. I think sometimes there's a reluctance to even accept the presence of women in chess. The kind of vitriol or being told that you should be taken to a guest. So it was a response to that, to some of the ugly online happen, but also to the potential to the creative when they are given a space to write, about, a topic. In this case, what your own take on a Lovecraft character. It had to be a woman character, and just do what you will. And so it was just fun to see what can happen when you give somebody the chance to play in that sandbox. And I think everybody did a great job. Molly did Asenath, and she did a really interesting take on her, and other people also did really interesting takes. Catherine Tobler did a kind of like a meta fiction kind of thing where the footnotes in the story were telling another story different from the general story. So I thought that was brilliant. We had a poem also from Anne K. Schrader, that kind of stuff. We had some illustrations. So it turned out to be a really kind of fun exercise that came from a very nasty episode.
No, and you guys definitely spun some amazing silk out of that sowsier, and the end result is fantastic. Did you have to approach this from a sort of a different position as an editor, knowing how much attention was being paid to it, knowing sort of the very different double standard it was going to be held to?
The thing is, it didn't attract much attention before it was published, even though we had an Indiegogo campaign and it raised, the funds. Everybody kind of was like, this is okay. And then after it came out and it had been out for a while, I guess some people discovered that it was out and they were like, I'm outraged. And at that point, it's like, it's already been on sale for months. It already won, I don't know, right? It won the it's been 2 years since. So fortunately, I think people were kind of distracted at the point when we were fundraising and kind of preparing it. Angry by something else.
Sorry, we're still having a little bit of audio issues that we're sort of working through. But
something else.
Yes, obviously the sort of the gremlins in the machine are trying to continue to disparage She Walks in Shadows and keep folks from knowing about it. But I want to move on from that to another one of your own personal anthology. Sort of combining both writing and editing yourself. Love and Other Poisons, another one from the PH Reads a Thing series. This was a fantastic read. As a mediocre white dude, there's a lot of areas of ignorance that I have. Not a lot of areas that I know I'm ignorant of, but Central America and Central American literature is something that I know absolutely nothing about. And so this really was very educational, it was very eye-opening and absolutely fascinating. There were stories here that are completely out of my realm of experience, and yet they were so evocative, dealing with sort of conflict zones, and the history of these places, and yet so very human, so very recognizable. Can you tell us about Love and Other Poisons and sort of what drove you to put this out in the world?
Was called The Strange Time. It was kind of like just a follow-up for fun, I guess, because I thought it had a different bent than the first collection, so I didn't want to put certain stories in the first collection, but I thought they could exist in another kind of collection, so I put them there. And so it was just that I thought that there was enough material for a second collection. There was all this material that I might have been interested in using, but I didn't use it in the first one because I thought, the palette wasn't very good. So I just, kind of put them there.
Oh, all right. And there we go again. So sorry, Sylvia. I'm sorry we're having these audio troubles. Obviously, we'll need to have you back on again to help iron out some of these issues. But I really want to thank you for coming on the show, for telling folks about your work working in the realm of horror and genre work. But you've done more than that. You've got a handful of novels out right now that folks should be aware of. I really want to make sure I hit Beautiful Ones, Certain Dark Things, and Signal to Noise. Signal to Noise, I've had a lot of fun following your following you talking about this, and also specifically the responding to criticisms about this story. It seems that a lot of people sort of on a gut level really like it, but then respond very negatively to what they call their unlikable characters, which is funny given the number, the popularity of Mad Men, the popularity of Breaking Bad, the popularity of any form of, narrative that's filled with unlikable characters. But for some reason, this book, they need the characters to be likable.
Yeah, I think allowed to be unlikable a lot more often than when you look at women. I think women get dinged with very small things, things like she didn't smile or stuff like that are enough to. Whereas with male characters, I mean, Hannibal Lecter eats people, and he's very likable. Apparently, Norman Bates from Psycho got a whole show, and I guess he was likable. Dexter is also another serial killer, and you are right, Mad Men too. The men of Mad Men. Um, so yeah, it's very strange. I think women are still held to a different standard, and we expect women to be good naturally, and I guess we kind of assume that men um, not only can be bad but are redeemable. Like
Oh,
there's always the
yes.
possibility of redemption, um, even in the most assholish of characters. And we don't think that about women, though, right? We don't think that Cersei Lannister is going to be redeemed. Um, but Jaime Lannister is doing a he's a pretty nasty guy. And now I know that Cersei is kind of like an unrepentant psycho, but I just think, um, yeah, that men have that opportunity, male characters have that opportunity to change. And you see it also in the discussions of Me Too that have been happening, how one of the first questions that people ask is not really, how are all these women dealing, processing with this situation? But it becomes like, well, how is this person going to redeem himself? How is he going to apologize, and how's he going to come back to the community? And sometimes it's like, it's too early to know, right? It's way too early, but we're already thinking about the redemption narrative, for men. And for women, sometimes it happens, but it just takes like a really huge amount of time. You look at athletes and how Mike Tyson kind of redeemed himself from being, this man who had done things that were not very nice at all. And then you look at Tonya Harding, and her. Mike Tyson has a cartoon, so
Yes.
I think it's a lot easier for male characters and for men in general in society to be given a second chance. And women, we just go like, nope, salt it all. She's no good, and she will never be any good. That's just because I think culturally we think like that.
Well, and even after the men die, they're redeemed, right? I mean, this is what we have to deal with in the Lovecraftian world, right? In fact, they're even more redeemable after they're dead. You're not allowed to say anything negative about them.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm sure no one will have any problem saying bad things about Marion Zimmer Bradley for a good long while.
Yes.
So Silvia, thank you so much for being on the show. I'm so sorry we had technical issues. Like I said, we're going to have you on again when the internet is being less of a butt. Where should people go to follow your work, to find out more about you?
You should go to my website, silviamoreno-garcia.com. And I'm on Twitter at SilviaMG. I'm there pretty regularly, so you can find me there. Or you can just go to the bookstore and get one of the books.
Fantastic. And what should folks be sort of looking out for? I know you guys just had a really successful Kickstarter for Nightmare Magazine, but what else should folks sort of be on the lookout for?
Yeah, well, Nightmare Magazine will have a double issue in December, so you should be checking out our double issue. And things that I'm doing, you should be looking out next spring in April for my fourth novel, which is going to be called Gods of Jade and Shadow. And it's a story in 1920s Mexico, and it has Mayan gods in quest to regain a throne for a god.
Very nice. Well, thank you so much, Silvia. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. And I hope we get you back on here before too long. This has been Ask Lovecraft After Dark. If you're interested in watching this show live, you can join the Ask Lovecraft Appreciation Society over on Facebook. If you're interested in following Ask Lovecraft itself, you could just go to asklovecraft.com. You can also follow my general meanderings on the internet at lehmankessler.com, and you can follow me screaming into the void on Twitter at Lehman Kessler. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Bye, guys.